Hebrews 13. We are into Hebrews 13. And I'll mention, a few weeks ago I used Leighton Paulson as a illustration in Sunday school. Leighton's here. He's recently graduated from Marine Boot Camp out in California. So glad that Leighton is with us today, getting ready to go back to California for additional training. So Hebrews 13, and we'll see, we won't finish today, but I think we'll probably finish maybe in the next week or two, this section. And then 2 weeks ago, so last week I was in Sioux City, Iowa for the weekend, and my daughter, older daughter, who's the smaller of the two, who visits here on occasion, who lives in Granite Falls, Sophia, we went to church in North Sioux City, South Dakota, last Sunday, and had a nice time there. That was a church we had attended before, but nice church, much like this one, uses the Majesty hymnal, and so we had a good time there. And now we're back here. For our next set of Sunday school, has there been any other ideas for our next Sunday school? Worldview was thrown out 2 weeks ago. It was tossed out as an idea. Not thrown out. It was just tossed out as an idea. But wondering if there was any other ideas yet, or if anybody else has said anything. Well, maybe we'll look that way. Oh, yes, Lee.
In the young adults group, we were going through the Baptist Catechism.
Yes.
And almost every single study we do on one of them, the person who we assign to different people, the person points out, yeah, I don't know if I agree with this, and I don't like the way they phrase that. And I was wondering if you could go through the Baptist Catechism and explain it, because there are a lot of points you raise where you're like, I don't know about that.
Okay, so. Good. So what Alethea was talking about, and I've mentioned it here before, I think I've read from it before here, is the Baptist Catechism. And she was just saying that with the young adult class, or on Saturdays, I guess, weekends, they've been working through some of it, and that they have questions. So maybe that would be an option as well, looking at part of the Baptist Catechism. We could always mix it up too, and bring in the Catechism where it applies, or just for fun, like you talked about politics last week, just for fun, right? So we can always throw in the Catechism, just for fun. No one was taken to the hospital afterwards, after bringing up politics. All right, so we'll keep looking at that, those ideas. So thanks for those ideas, and we'll try to narrow that down over the next few weeks. And maybe it'd be a good. I'm just thinking out loud, but we could look at some of the catechism questions just to get us over to New Year's, and then maybe start a new section in New Year's too. Could do that. All right, that'll give me time to prepare for the next Sunday school series. All right, Hebrews 13. Now, believe it or not, I just keep looking at the clock. That's all I'm looking at on my phone. Hebrews 13, one of the most difficult questions is whether or not Hebrews 13 was originally part of the book of Hebrews. And that's because there's kind of an abrupt change. Our translators and the early people who put the Bible into verses and chapters kind of felt like the end of chapter 12 was the end of the sermon. Sometimes Hebrews is called a sermon, Hebrews 1 through 12. It's like a preached message. And the early idea was that sermon ended at the end of chapter 12 with kind of that summary statement, therefore let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. And those two verses, 28 and 29, really summarize the message of the whole book. Christianity is an internal religion, like the Old Testament religion was supposed to be, but we also exercise it internally, not with external rituals. And that's been the point of the author the whole time. But the God of the Old Testament, the God who established the rituals, is the same God of the New Testament. So in the Old Testament, you should have come with reverence and awe when you brought sacrifices to the temple and went through the rituals. But now in the New Testament, we should still approach him with reverence and awe. And a couple weeks ago, we talked a little bit about that. We spent some time just talking about what reverence and awe look like. So that is what our God is worthy of. And there is still kind of that warning that our God is a consuming fire. So though we have bold access through Christ to God spiritually, we can draw near to him. We don't come to him flippantly. We don't come to him, and take him lightly. Think of God as silly. We don't come to him approaching him that way. We still come to him with reverence and awe. So that's how we approach him. Now, chapter 13 starts with what appears to be a bunch of random commands. And actually, Pastor, we looked at 1 Thessalonians 5, right? And 1 Thessalonians 5, I don't know if you noticed this earlier in the sermon, but starting in verse 12, Paul says, "We ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord and admonish you." Now, you also keep that in mind because there's a parallel in Hebrews 13 that we'll probably get to next week. "And to esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Be at peace among yourselves. And we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak. Be patient with them all. See that no one repays evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to everyone. Rejoice always. Pray without ceasing. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. Do not quench the spirit. Do not despise prophecies, but test everything." And then he starts a benediction in verse 23. "Now may the God of peace himself sanctify you completely." And then he goes into that. So you see how Paul, at the end of that letter, kind of throws out these random, kind of short, here's a whole bunch of stuff I wish I had more time to talk about, but I don't. I'm just going to spit it out. It's the long goodbye.
Sort of like you ran out of room on the scroll.
Yeah, it's kind of like you ran out of room on the scroll, and he's got to, write up the margin and that kind of thing to try to squeeze it in, okay, I won't take that road trail. Anyway, so he was, so you see that, okay, so in Hebrews 13, we have something similar, or it appears that we have something similar, where we have some, what appear to be random injunctions, and then followed by benediction in verse 20, and a couple closing comments in verse 22 through 25. So there's a similar pattern. This is one reason, it's actually because of chapter 13, some people think that Paul wrote the book of Hebrews, because it's very similar to other letters like 1 Thessalonians. I guess on Jeopardy this last week, this made the news. So the TV show Jeopardy, which, if you're like me, makes you feel stupid when you watch it because you don't know any of the answers. But someone asked, the clue was the author of the book of Hebrews, the letter to the book of Hebrews. And someone said it was Paul, and Paul was considered the right answer on Jeopardy. And then half the internet blew up and was like, no, it wasn't Paul. So it made headline news. But this is one reason that some people think that Paul did write it, was these similarities. Some people actually go on to think that maybe chapter 13 was written by Paul, and someone took the Hebrew letter to the Hebrews and just took this ending that they had from Paul from another lost letter, and they copied it and pasted it onto the end. But we have no evidence for that. That's just speculation. So I think it belongs, but it is kind of a new section. I think the main part of the letter ends at the end of chapter 12 because of those concluding verses. And there is a little bit of a change. Now, having said that, in Hebrews 13, I think verses 1 through 6 actually do go together. I think they are all talking about the same thing. And then verses 7 through 18, 19, I guess, actually are kind of a unit that all go together. And so we'll look at those today. I'm hoping we'll get through 1 through 6, and then we'll look at perhaps 7 through 19 next Sunday. So we'll read Hebrews 13, verses 1 through 6. And work our way through it. Hebrews 13, verse 1 says, "Let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Remember those who are in prison, as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you are also in the body. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. Keep your life free from the love of money, and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear, comma, what can man do to me? Actually, semicolon. What can man do to me? So that verse is sometimes read, I will not fear what man can do to me. Here it's a question. All right, so the question for chapter 13, let brotherly love continue. So the word, the question is verse 1 an actual imperative like the other things in the list? It's number 1 on the list of all of these things on the list. Or is it kind of like a title? Here's the theme that he's going to talk about over the next few verses, brotherly love. And that's the question. I think either way, it's probably, we could take it as an imperative in either way. But it does show that there's a link in verses 1 through 6, and it's going to be based on love. You're going to see that theme is through all of these verses. Now, brotherly love. Does anybody know what the Greek word is for this? Brotherly love? Philadelphia. So the name, the city, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, is known as the city of brotherly love. And nowadays, from what I understand, brothers in Philadelphia don't get along very well because it's pretty high crime. But that's, you hear that stated as the slogan of the city. Well, that's because that's the word, Philadelphia. That's what it means. Philos, or philia in this case, the feminine, and adelphos, which we get brotherly from, brothers from. So let brotherly love continue, or remain, or abide. In other words, we have a responsibility towards one another in love. And this is all he says about it. But in verse 2, he goes on, he says, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. Now, brotherly love is one word in Greek. And do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. That hospitality to strangers is one word in the Greek. And it means to love strangers. So if we have brotherly love in verse 1, we have strangerly love in verse 2. In other words, this is the love of a foreigner kind of idea, of a stranger. This concept goes way back in the Greek world. Is anyone familiar with the story of the Odyssey? Anybody? Somebody? Okay. Homer's Odyssey is all about the love of stranger. It's actually about the love of home. But until Odysseus gets home, which the book is all about getting home, he's a stranger until he gets home. And even once he gets home, at the beginning of the story, or at the part in which he first gets home, he's still a stranger. He's still unknown until the very end of the book. It's actually kind of a touching love story, the Odyssey. But Anyway, it's all about being a stranger. So the idea of showing hospitality to a stranger back then, back in the day, in the early, in the time the Bible was written, Odyssey was written hundreds of years before, 900 years before Christ. But you have this idea, even in the Bible, was you have believers who are traveling from place to place. And you didn't have a Howard Johnson, or if I can date myself, or a Holiday Inn place to stay, where you knew that every town was going to have one of these hotels and you could go stay there, or a Super 8 motel or something, where you could go. And my dad would do this when we were kids. It was the whole station wagon thing. Pile up in the station wagon and head out at 4 o'clock in the morning somewhere, and then drive till 5 o'clock at night, find a motel, pull in, and unload the car. Right? That's how we did our road trips as kids. You didn't have that in the ancient world. And as Christians were moving around, or as Christians were fleeing persecution, they needed safe places to go. And so you might find out that, hey, I know this person who lives in this place. Stop by, tell them I sent you, and then they'll let you stay there. This was kind of the attitude of having love, translated hospitality, having love for a stranger. We see this in one of the parables in the New Testament of the one family whose strangers show up in the middle of the night. I have guests in my home, and I don't have any bread to feed them. And they go knock on the neighbor's door next door. Can you give me some bread to feed to the strangers who have just showed up at my home? These guests. So, hence hospitality. That's why they translate it hospitality. He says, so don't neglect, in other words, to show hospitality. Okay, so don't, when strangers come along, don't turn them away, but show them hospitality. And then he says, why? Why should we show them hospitality? For thereby some have entertained angels unaware. Okay, so they were entertaining, it was an angel that came to their door and asked for hospitality. And they showed them hospitality to the angel. Okay, so a lot of people will think of Abraham when 3 men come by his place, and he shows them hospitality. Now, 2 of them we know are angels who go on to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. We know the 3rd was the Lord, who came to speak with Abraham to let him know that Sarah was going to conceive. This is where Sarah laughed. Oh, that story. So some people think about that Abraham was entertaining angels and he didn't know it. Okay, he was unaware of it. The question is whether or not that Paul is saying that these believers, or not Paul, that the author of Hebrews was saying in the 1st century, in the late 60s AD, that they were going to be entertaining angels, like spirit beings, at their home. So this is kind of a controversial thing. Some people just think, yeah, that's what he said. It's just angels. There's actually angels who could show up at your door seeking hospitality. Now that seems odd that they would do that, but we have the story in the Old Testament where it happened, so maybe angels stop by and need you to be hospitable to them. It seems a little odd. But the word angel also means messenger, usually a godly messenger, but it's the same word for messenger. It doesn't have to be an angelic being. So some people take this as, well, maybe as people were moving around in the 1st century, Christians were moving around in the 1st century, you had evangelists who were moving around, you had missionaries who were moving around, you had apostles and prophets who were moving around. So maybe that's what he has in mind. That someone knocking on your door asking for hospitality, you just turn them away, but you just turned away someone who was going off to be a missionary. They were on an errand from the Lord in this early days, like Paul and Barnabas were, like Titus, like Timothy. They're being sent out to go do something, and you've just turned them away. So that's the other way of looking at it. If you ask my opinion, I think it could go. I think it could go either way. But they both of those views have merit to them. When he's talking about entertaining angels and not knowing it. So it could go either way. I was surprised, actually, as how many commentaries just said it was angels, just spirit beings that it would be. But there's one good commentary that I like, one author in particular, and he said, yeah, it probably could be taken literally, but at the end of the day, it probably was messengers more generically. So, I don't know. Pastor, do you know?
No.
Okay.
Although I wonder why it would be mentioned in this way if it was mundane.
If it was just angels, you mean? Or no, just people?
Regular messenger. Why would it be an extraordinary mention? You know, careful, you might entertain a normal guy.
Okay, so a normal guy, because our pastor is a normal guy.
Well, these messengers weren't necessarily pastors.
Well, they weren't necessarily pastors, but they would have been messengers who were journeying for some reason.
By the churches.
They're authorized by the churches. So, it could have been like a Barnabas.
Yeah.
Imagine that a Barnabas and a Timothy show up at your door, and they're like, hey, we're trying to get over to Macedonia. Do you mind if we stop here for a little while? Or maybe on their way to Antioch. We're on our way up to Antioch, and we need a place to stay for the night before we get there. And so now, oh, sure, we don't know who you are, but we'll just let you come in and then wish you well on your way. Now, we could actually cross-reference 2 John here, which would add strength to the idea that, let's just do that. So in 2 John, it's the opposite, but I think we can apply it. Let's see if I can make the case. Okay, so 2 John, now I take 2 John as being written to a church. I take the elect lady and her children as being the church, okay, just to let you know that. But verse 7, many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist. Watch yourselves so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win a full reward. In other words, don't be deceived by this person. Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. Now, verse 10, if anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting, for whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works. Okay, so this is talking about a false teacher who comes in. If a false teacher comes into the church, you don't let them come into the church. And I have said this before, I would expect that if I preach heresy from the pulpit, that the deacons would come up there and physically remove me from the building and throw me in a snowbank. That's what I would expect to happen. So if someone comes in and is teaching that Jesus is not God, okay, that's specifically the doctrine that he mentions here, it says you are not to receive him into your house or give him even a greeting, like, good day, for whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works. Now, let's turn that around, speaking about angels in Hebrews 13. Well, what if they are preachers of the gospel? What if they are teaching what is true? And you should greet them. You should welcome them into your home. You should let them speak. And when you do that, then you are taking part of his good deeds. And this is, I could also support this. We're talking about, where's the verse? When you give money, is it Philippians 4? you give money, I think it's Philippians 4, towards Paul's ministry, then part of the reward is ours. So when we support missionaries who are doing good work on the mission field, we benefit from that because we are participating in their ministry by faithful giving. Okay, so if we take all of that and come back to Hebrews 13, we could argue that it's messengers, human messengers, and not angels. Although I don't know that I saw that argued anywhere in preparing for Sunday school, but I like it. We'll go with it. No?
So many people in a situation where they need a place to stay. And they're complete, total strangers. I mean, totally. I have no connection with the church. Nobody sent a little they're good people, how's them, you know, kind of a thing. Well, you don't know what they're like until they're already in there.
Yep.
You know? So,
Yep, for both good and bad, right? Right, because we've heard some of your stories. Yeah, you don't know good or bad. So one of the things that's different, I don't know if it was different, there's always a risk, right? Whenever we take someone in that we don't know,
right.
there's always a risk. Pastors in North Minneapolis used to say this all the time. You know, you never know when the person is trying to deceive you. If they're good at deceiving you, they're going to end up deceiving you. And sometimes you just have to, you know, give it your best shot. There's a balance, maybe, if I can put it that way, of where the risk begins to outweigh the reward, right? So like my daughter and I, Sophia and I were talking about this. You know, she's a young single girl who, you know, even if she was fully clothed and sopping wet, might weigh 100 pounds. She would have to be very careful how to exercise hospitality given her situation in life, right? Because there's at some point where the risk to herself is great. But yeah, it's a hard call. I don't know that I have an answer, because I have a good friend of mine who is very hospitable, and one time she stopped to help someone on the side of the road. Well, they weren't broken down, they just pretended to be, and they mugged her, left her in the ditch, and took off. And she was also kind of just a petite little lady, but she just thought she'd help. And yeah, so that's why in the Twin Cities they say don't help people. Yeah, I don't know if I have an answer. Good luck, Doug.
What if they have white shirts and ties?
If they have white shirts and ties. Now, okay, so this is a little far afield, but it depends. I've heard this conversation in regard to 2 John. Now, I take 2 John on face value as being in the church. So we don't welcome these people into the church. We don't extend them Christian fellowship. We don't give them a platform for speaking. None of that. So, you know, if the United Methodist Church in town wants pastor to go speak over there and he wants to go preach the gospel, that's up to him. If they say, oh, now will you let our woman pastor come over here and preach to your congregation? He has, no, we're not going to do that. Okay, that's how I take that. Now, some people have applied this to your own house, so they come to your own house, knowing that the Jehovah's Witnesses in town are going to come to your house, they're going to knock on your door, and they're going to try to convince you that Jesus is not God. They're going to try to convince you that he is his own God, the God of this planet. And what do you do in that case? And I think from 2 John, the answer is you close the door in their face. You don't give them a chance to speak. You don't argue with them. Now, if you want to meet them someplace else and argue with them, if you want to get into a debate in some other forum, well, go for it. If you think you have an in to convince them, or the silent partner or something like that. But if they're at your door and you take 2 John seriously, you're not going to even let them attempt anything. And it's not just because of you, but it's also because those who are in your household. So I know a man who would, I don't know if he still does it, but he had small kids at home at the time, and he would ask, "Oh, you're from, Kingdom Hall or whatever." Yeah, that's what we're doing. He said, "Would you mind if I got my wife and kids to come to the door?" "Oh, no, that'd be great." So he'd call his family, they'd come to the door, and he would say to his wife and children, "Mark these men, they are deceivers who do not preach the truth of the gospel of God's word. And if you ever see them, avoid them." And he would close the door. So it's not like, trying to keep a telemarketer on the phone for a couple hours. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about someone whose intention, now this is the thing, they aren't just confused. It's their intention to deceive you with a false gospel. They're coming with that in purpose. And that's what makes the difference. You can talk to a lot of people who are confused about a lot of things. When my daughters were at the college, they had a group of friends. A couple of them were conservative Catholics from Ghent. One was a Lutheran from Tracy, and then there was a couple Baptists there, and then there would be other people who would join them. But they said it was terrible. They always felt bad for the Lutheran. Because, he grew up in the Lutheran church, he went through catechism, but he didn't care anything about religion, and he didn't know his own doctrine. But the Baptists knew their doctrine, the Catholics knew their doctrine, and they were getting on him for not knowing his own doctrine. Like, what is your problem? He's like, "I don't want to talk about religion." And they're like, "You should want to talk about religion." And stuff like that. So that's different. That's a different situation than when someone's coming with the intention of deceiving. All right. I think we squashed that one.
Can I add one?
Oh, yeah.
Well, when Joanne asked her question, I was thinking along the same lines. Do you sit down at the kitchen table and compare doctrinal statements until, you make a decision? It's just like, how far does this go? And you gave us the risk-reward balance. And then you also said, if it's a known heretical group, find a way to slam the door. It's just, as a Christian, you almost want to err on the side of welcome, because we've got a message.
Right. We've got a default.
You err on the side of risk.
Our default is to not neglect that love of stranger. The love for strangers who come to our door. That should be kind of our default, but maybe with, you always sleep with one eye open kind of thing.
My kids always came in our bedroom when we didn't close the door, but there wasn't a lock on it. But my kids were like,
so there's always that, and we all have, I know you have your stories, and there was a couple that we knew of, they were just selling a used car from their house, and this guy came to buy their car, and this is in the Twin Cities, and